get the advantage. Look at the underneath and the finish. Yeah, tough rake across the face. I mean, the athleticism at year 14 is still just incredible. I mean, she picks her dribble up on the right.
Extension was discussed both at a committee level and at the board, and ultimately
something unprecedented is happening inside professional basketball right now, and most people still do not fully understand just how deep this goes. What started as a single moment on a playoff court has spiraled into one of the most polarizing controversies in the history of women's professional sports. We are not talking about a disputed trade, a contract holdout, or a locker room argument. We're talking about a black eye, a missing whistle, a viral explosion, and a league suddenly forced to look hard in the mirror and ask itself a brutally uncomfortable question. How far is too far? The answer to that question has already begun reshaping the entire sport from the inside out. And the names at the center of it all are ones you already know. But what you probably do not know is just how layered, how calculated, and how consequential this whole situation truly runs. So before you make up your mind, stay with us for the full story, because there are details here that most people completely missed. And if you enjoy breakdowns like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss another one. We cover these stories before they go mainstream, and trust us, you do not want to be late to this conversation. To understand why this moment hit the way it did, you have to start from the very beginning of what Caitlin Clark's arrival actually meant for the WNBA as a business and as a cultural institution. Because this is not just a story about a foul. This is a story about money, power, and the uncomfortable growing pains of a league evolving faster than anyone was prepared for. Before Clark entered the league, the WNBA was respected but modestly watched. Television ratings were decent, arenas were partially filled, and corporate sponsorships were present but not exactly aggressive. Then Clark walked in. Almost overnight, everything shifted. Television ratings shattered long-standing records. Arenas that once operated at comfortable capacity suddenly found fans camped outside desperate for standing room tickets. Corporate giants that had never previously paid serious attention to women's basketball were suddenly writing enormous checks to get their logos in front of the audiences Clark was pulling in. The economic transformation was genuinely staggering. Merchandise sales skyrocketed across the entire league, meaning teams that were not even Clark's own franchise were benefiting financially from her star power, drawing eyes to the sport as a whole. Her deep three-pointers, her pinpoint passes, her ability to perform under pressure, and her natural magnetism in front of camera turned a competitive league into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Millions of people who had never watched a single quarter of women's basketball were suddenly clearing their schedules for primetime tip-offs. But here is the uncomfortable reality that fame at that level always creates. When someone becomes the face of an entire sport, they also become the target. And for Clark, that target appeared very quickly. Veteran players across the league made no secret of their intention to test her physically. That is simply the professional code. Rookies get initiated. They get bumped, they get bodied, they get pushed off their comfortable spots on the court until they either prove they belong or they fade. For most rookies, this process plays out quietly, noticed only by coaches and scouts. But Clark was not most rookies. Every single play involving her was being watched by millions. Every bump, every hard screen, every aggressive defensive sequence was being captured, shared, and dissected by an audience that was not always familiar enough with basketball to separate standard physical defense from something more sinister. That context is important, because when the moment with Dijonai Carrington finally came, the entire world was already watching. The atmosphere inside the arena for that playoff matchup was electric in the way that only postseason basketball can generate. Stakes were high, emotions were running even higher, and both teams understood that every possession could be the one that defined the entire series. Within the first quarter of play, however, the game stopped being just about basketball. Carrington was locked in defensively, pressing with the kind of aggressive intensity that had defined her reputation throughout her career. As Clark pushed the ball forward, Carrington reached hard across to disrupt the dribble. But instead of making contact with the ball, her hand dragged directly across Clark's face, striking her square in the eye with enough force that Clark immediately dropped to the hardwood, both hands clutching her face as the play continued around her without pause. No whistle, no stoppage, nothing. Clark eventually pulled herself back to her feet and continued competing, but the evidence of what had just happened was impossible to hide. A prominent, visible bruise began forming around her almost immediately, darkening as the game progressed and becoming impossible to ignore on broadcast cameras. She was playing through what was visually undeniable eye trauma, and the officials who were standing just feet away when it happened had called absolutely nothing. Within minutes, replays were everywhere. Zoomed in, slow motion, frame-by-frame clips circulated across every major social media platform simultaneously, with each version accumulating millions of views before the first half had even concluded. Fans were not just angry, they were stunned, because the footage did not look like a glancing blow or an awkward collision. It looked like a direct, full-contact swipe across the face of the league's most important player, and the people whose job it was to protect players on the court had simply let it pass. The narrative was already forming, and what happened next would pour gasoline directly onto the fire. Post-game press conferences became their own separate spectacle as commentators, analysts, former players, and coaches weighed in with wildly different perspectives. The basketball community fractured almost immediately down very clear lines. On one side were those who argued that Carrington's hand movement showed an unnatural trajectory, one that had no legitimate basketball purpose and carried a level of risk that crossed well beyond acceptable defensive aggression. Reaching across to disrupt a dribble does not require making contact above the shoulders, and the fact that it happened at all raised serious questions about intent versus execution. On the other side were the defenders of physical play, the purists who argued that elite basketball is a contact sport by design, that misjudged steal attempts happen hundreds of times per season, and that the outrage was being amplified beyond proportion by fans who were emotionally invested in protecting Clark rather than evaluating the play objectively. The debate might have stayed there, simmering respectfully on both sides, if it had not been for a second piece of footage that changed everything. Video surfaced, captured from a separate camera angle focused on the bench area, appearing to show Carrington in the moments following the hit, apparently imitating the motion of the swipe and reacting with what viewers interpreted as amusement. The footage was not conclusive. Context is always difficult to extract from a bench reaction captured in passing, but perception in the court of public opinion moves faster than evidence ever can. What had been a genuinely debatable basketball play suddenly looked, to millions of viewers, like a calculated act of psychological intimidation followed by a celebration of it. The story was no longer about a missed foul call. It had become something else entirely. To make the situation even more combustible, that initial hit was not the only contentious moment between the two players during the game. Later in the contest, as Clark pushed the pace in transition, Carrington delivered a hard body check that sent the rookie completely off balance and crashing into the hardwood with a force that was completely disproportionate to what the play required. This was not a perimeter battle for positioning. This was not a bump while fighting through a screen. This was a hard, direct collision that took Clark off her feet on a play that did not call for that level of physicality. The cameras caught it. The crowd reacted to it. And analysts on national broadcast networks immediately flagged it as a second data point in what was beginning to look like a very deliberate pattern. Two aggressive physical incidents in a single game, both involving the same two players, both going uncalled on the floor. That combination was simply too much for the sports media ecosystem to ignore or contextualize away. And when you pulled back and looked at the history between these two players across the regular season, the pattern became even harder to dismiss. Throughout the year, Carrington had already drawn public attention for physical bumps and animated on-court gestures, specifically during matchups against Indiana. She had never hidden her physical defensive identity. That grit was a core part of her professional brand and a quality her teammates and coaches openly valued. But critics began noticing that the energy whenever these two teams met seemed to escalate beyond standard competitive intensity into something that felt personal and targeted. Even away from the court, subtle social media exchanges and indirect shade created a documented narrative of animosity between the two camps that fans had been following like a real-time drama series for months. By the time the playoffs arrived, the fuse had already been lit. That physical sequence in the opening quarter was simply the moment it finally ignited. Now here's where the story moves beyond the court and into the boardrooms that actually control the future of this league. Because while the WNBA operates with its own leadership structure, the influence of the broader NBA executive hierarchy, and specifically the long shadow of Commissioner Adam Silver, cannot be overlooked when multi-million-dollar television deals and global brand reputation are suddenly under threat. Silver has spent decades carefully constructing a basketball ecosystem built on three pillars: star power, commercial appeal, and a product that international audiences find compelling and trustworthy. Every single policy decision he oversees is filtered through the lens of what protects those three pillars long-term. And when international sports headlines start leading with photographs of a bruised and blackened eye on the face of the league's most valuable commercial asset, those three pillars take a direct and measurable hit. Rumors began circulating through industry circles almost immediately after the game that high-level executive meetings had taken place behind closed doors. Sources described an atmosphere of genuine discomfort among top-level leadership, with discussion centering around what message was being broadcast to the global audience the league had spent an entire year trying to build. Corporate partners were paying enormous sums to be associated with the energy and excitement Clark brought to the sport. They were not paying to have their brands adjacent to footage of an uncalled hit, leaving a black eye on that same player with no immediate consequence. The pressure was real. It was financial, and it was not going away quietly. While executives processed the commercial implications, the officiating crew from that game found themselves under a separate and very intense form of scrutiny. Referees operate under enormous pressure in any high-stakes environment, and professional basketball moves at a pace that makes real-time judgment incredibly difficult. That context exists, and it is fair. But there is also a standard protocol that is clearly established for situations involving contact above the shoulders, particularly when that contact is with the head or face area of a player. That protocol exists precisely because the stakes are too high to rely entirely on a referee's split-second in-the-moment assessment. The protocol calls for review. The protocol calls for consideration of a flagrant foul. Neither happened, and that failure to follow established procedure under the bright lights of a nationally televised playoff game opened the door to every criticism that followed. Fans demanded explanations. Former players questioned the consistency of officiating standards. Commentators on major sports networks openly speculated about whether high-profile rookies were being afforded less protection than established veterans in referee decision-making. That last accusation was particularly damaging because it framed the officiating failure not as a mistake, but as a systemic bias. And once that framing took hold in public discourse, the league office had no choice but to act. If the referees were not going to handle it in real time, the front office would have to deliver the consequences after the fact. Speculation about what those consequences might look like reached levels that the league had not seen in years. Reports of internal discussions included potential suspensions ranging from single games to multiple playoff matchups, heavy financial penalties, and sweeping policy overhauls targeting repeat physical foul offenders. While a permanent ban from professional play is an extreme measure almost exclusively reserved for catastrophic integrity violations with a legal dimension, the threat of extended indefinite suspension until behavioral assurances were provided became a very serious topic of conversation within league circles. What made this discussion particularly significant was its scope. Executives were not merely evaluating a single incident involving two players. They were confronting a structural question about whether the current flagrant foul criteria were equipped to handle a league that had suddenly grown into a mainstream entertainment property with a global audience and multi-billion-dollar broadcast agreements on the table. Proposals circulated around mandating automatic league office review for any on-court contact above the shoulder line, regardless of whether a whistle was blown during live play. The idea being that the referee on the floor is one safeguard, but not the only safeguard, and that when the floor official fails, the institutional backstop must be robust enough to catch what was missed. For players across the league, the message was stark and unmistakable. The era where physical aggression against marquee talent carried minimal risk of serious consequence was officially closing. A new accountability framework was being built in real time, and Carrington found herself at the very center of it. As league officials deliberated and media coverage exploded, the players themselves were having their own deeply complicated conversation about what all of this meant. Within the Players Association, the debate exposed divisions that had clearly been developing beneath the surface for some time. Some veteran players expressed genuine frustration with what they characterized as differential media treatment for high-profile rookies, arguing that physical initiation has always been part of how professional athletes prove they belong, and that the outrage surrounding Clark was disproportionate to what actually occurs in games across the league every single night. Others took a different position, acknowledging that certain lines have been crossed and that the long-term credibility of the league as a safe and professional environment depended on players holding each other to a standard that reflected the moment they were all living in. Because every player in that league was benefiting from the commercial tide that Clark's arrival had generated. Salaries were rising. Sponsorship opportunities were multiplying. Media coverage was expanding. Walking that back by allowing the product to be defined by images of uncalled physical targeting was not in anyone's interest, regardless of how they felt about the media attention surrounding any one player. That tension between competitive tradition and modern commercial responsibility defined the atmosphere in every league meeting held during this period. And it was not resolved quickly or cleanly. While internal debates played out, the media apparatus was running its own parallel investigation. Sports biomechanics analysts, retired professional players, and forensic video specialists all weighed in across national platforms, breaking down the specific trajectory of Carrington's hand movement frame by frame and comparing it against standard defensive positioning during perimeter steal attempts. The near consensus from that analytical community was that natural reach-across motions in those situations do not typically result in full palm contact with an opponent's face unless the reach extends significantly beyond what the ball's position requires. That technical framing kept the story alive and prominent on national sports debate programs for days after the initial incident. Every time the story threatened to fade, another broadcast segment would resurface the footage. Another former player would offer their interpretation, and the cycle would restart. Clark's visible eye trauma throughout the remainder of the game served as a constant visual anchor that kept the emotional stakes high and the audience engaged. League officials quickly realized that a quiet, under-the-radar resolution was simply not available to them. The media infrastructure surrounding this story was too large, too motivated, and too well supplied with footage to allow anything less than a clear and public institutional response. Behind the scenes, both franchises were navigating the situation with an extremely delicate internal touch. The Indiana Fever organization was in the difficult position of needing to advocate loudly enough for their players' safety to satisfy fans and sponsors, while being careful not to come across as complaining about the physical nature of playoff basketball in a way that would undermine Clark's competitive reputation or make the franchise look like they were seeking special treatment rather than equal enforcement of existing rules. The Connecticut Sun organization faced a different but equally complicated challenge. They needed to support Carrington publicly as a professional and as a teammate, while simultaneously counseling her privately on the very real institutional risk she was now operating under. Film sessions reportedly shifted focus toward defensive hand placement and emotional regulation, specifically in the context of matchups against Indiana. Coaches understood clearly that another physical incident of this nature would trigger consequences that could affect the entire team's playoff run. Both locker rooms, in their own separate ways, were forever changed by the national microscope that had been placed over this rivalry. Coaches were coaching differently, players were playing differently, and the fans watching from home had no idea just how much had shifted behind the closed doors of those practice facilities. It would be impossible to tell this story accurately without addressing the role that social media played in turning a competitive basketball rivalry into a full-scale cultural event. Algorithms on short-form video platforms are specifically designed to reward content that generates strong emotional reactions, and footage of a direct hit to the face of the most watched player in women's basketball generated exactly that. Clips that might have circulated modestly in previous years spread to tens of millions of accounts across multiple platforms within hours, reaching audiences who had never watched a WNBA game and who formed their entire understanding of the situation from a 3-second zoomed-in replay with no broader context. Fan-made compilation videos began appearing, stitching together every physical incident involving Carrington and Clark across the entire season into a single narrative of targeted aggression. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Hashtags trended nationally. The story crossed over from sports media into general news cycles. Political commentators weighed in. Cultural critics weighed in. The conversation expanded so far beyond basketball that the sport itself almost became secondary to the broader debate about fairness, accountability, and who deserves protection in professional athletics. Carrington addressed the online atmosphere publicly, maintaining that her approach to defense is always grounded in competitive intent and that the viral framing of isolated moments strips away the broader context of elite physical basketball. But public perception, once calcified by millions of repeated viewings of a single damaging clip, is extraordinarily difficult to reshape through press conference statements alone. The narrative had already been written in real time by the internet, and institutional response was the only thing capable of shifting it. When you place this situation within the historical context of how professional sports leagues have handled similar moments, a clear pattern emerges. Leagues have consistently found that allowing repeated physical targeting of marquee talent, even when individually defensible as basketball plays, creates cumulative reputational damage that outweighs any short-term competitive benefit. The NBA itself has amended its flagrant foul and player safety protocols multiple times over the decades, specifically in response to moments where public perception reached a tipping point and demanded structural change. The WNBA now finds itself at one of those pivot points. The implicit authority that league leadership holds to bench a player indefinitely pending behavioral assurances, to mandate review processes that operate independently of in-game officiating, and to impose financial consequences that make reckless physical play economically unviable for any player regardless of their contract size. All of that authority is now being exercised with a visibility and seriousness that sends a clear signal across the entire league. No individual player's defensive identity is more valuable than the health of the league's commercial future. That is the line, and it has now been drawn in permanent ink. The immediate and already visible consequence of all of this is a measurable shift in how games are being officiated. Zero-tolerance standards for contact near the head and neck area are being applied with a consistency that simply did not exist before this controversy reached its peak. Officiating crews are initiating instant replay reviews for high contact that previously would have been swallowed as a common foul or waved off entirely. The threshold for a flagrant designation has effectively been lowered in practical application, even before any formal rule change has been ratified on paper. Players across the league are adjusting their defensive approaches accordingly. Physical defense remains a valued and legitimate part of elite basketball, but the spatial boundaries within which that physicality is acceptable have been clarified in a way that makes the previous ambiguity no longer viable as a defense for reckless high contact. Carrington's career trajectory moving forward will be watched more closely than perhaps any other defender in the league. Every defensive possession she plays will be evaluated not just by the referees on the floor, but by a league office that is now acutely aware of how quickly one moment can become a national story. That level of scrutiny is not comfortable, but it is the direct consequence of finding yourself at the center of a controversy that reshaped the standards of an entire professional sport. Here is the thing that most people are still missing when they debate this situation in comment sections and on sports talk shows. This was never really just about one foul call or even one rivalry. It was a stress test, an uncomfortable, publicly visible stress test of whether a league experiencing the fastest growth in its history had the institutional infrastructure to protect what was driving that growth. The answer that has emerged imperfectly and with more drama than anyone planned for is that the league is building that infrastructure in real time. Rule discussions are happening. Officiating standards are being revised. Executive accountability is being exercised with a seriousness that the previous era of the league simply did not require. And at the center of all of it is one rookie playing with a black eye, refusing to come off the floor. Whatever side of this debate you fall on, that image tells you something important about where the sport is right now. It is growing, it is competitive, it is complicated, and it is absolutely must-watch television. The only question left is whether the league can grow fast enough to keep up with the moment it has created. And that story, genuinely, is still being written. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, we genuinely appreciate you. This is exactly the kind of deep dive content we work hard to bring you, and your support is what makes it possible. Hit that like button if this gave you something to think about. Drop your take in the comments below, because we read every single one, and subscribe if you're not already part of the community. There's a lot more coming, and you do not want to miss it.